Hello there, music fans. Welcome to Music is a Journey. I'm Peter. One of the things I love to do is to look back into the history of heavy metal. Go back into the 1950s to the Chicago blues scene where they're playing guitars with overdrive sometimes, guitar solos, vocals are sometimes bellowed or shouted or gruffer sounding. Of course, you got to have rock and roll. In the 1960s, then you get your garage rock scene, your riff-based songs with the guitar solos again. Sometimes the vocals are shouted or there's even screams in the songs. You get your British blues scene with more experimentations with distortion, again guitar solos, then psychedelia with all that more fuzz tone, experimenting outside of the pentatonic blues scale, using different scales and combining different notes and chords to give new kinds of feelings to the music. And then we get into the heavier rebirth of the electric blues there by the late 1960s. But one of the things that I think really takes heavy rock and heavy psychedelic music from that area into heavy metal is the inclusion of inspiration from classical music. And we see this happening in the late 60s there, 67, 68. Bands start, especially in England, start incorporating ideas or composition approaches from classical music. And you combine this approach with this heavier approach to rock, and you can get some wonderful new types of sounds. The important reason is because classical music is not based on the pentatonic scale of 5 notes. It has the full natural scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. As well, classical music can use other different types of scales. And there's just a wonderful arrangement of how you play the notes, how you organize the notes. And most importantly, I feel, is the inclusion of the semitone, which the pentatonic scale avoids. When you have, if you think about your piano keyboard and you have your white, black keys, there are 2 places where the white keys are side by side. That is where a semitone happens, where the next note in the scale is actually only a half tone up. Where the black keys come in, that is where there is a full tone between the 2 white keys. Blues does make use of semitones in one case. I'll show you here on this keyboard setup on my phone. So you can hear by inserting a semitone between these 2 full tones in this one part, you actually get like 2 semitones together, and that gives a very bluesy feeling. However, classical music using the full natural scale has 2 semitones in the scale. Of course, you can do more than that, and that just creates different moods. Like the use of a semitone can give a feeling of peace and beauty. It can also give a piece of intensity, of menace, foreboding. So once bands started tapping into classical music, the range of possibilities just grew. One of the most important and influential classical pieces on rock, particularly heavy rock and heavy metal, is The Planets by Gustav Holst. Now, that was the first piece in a suite where each of the planets had its own composition. And Mars is quite a striking opening piece because it is quite menacing. Bringer of War has exactly the feeling that war is coming, war is happening. And I want to play the main theme that stands out, that is the most influential in rock music. So I'm just going to play it here off my phone and this little portable speaker here that I have. I don't know how much of that I can play and get away with without getting any kind of copyright warnings. But anyway, you hear it there, that bum, 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 that part there. So that, I'm going to show you here on the keyboard again. This is how that whole stretch there, that whole theme is played out on the keyboard. So very importantly, we can see this Mars chord is actually constructed of a bunch of semitones. And you can feel by listening to the music that there is this ominous feeling to it. And again, the backing to that main melody, that bum, ba 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 bum, ba 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 bum, of course, that also gives a feeling of some excitement, intensity, something is going to happen. There was a band called Sands from England that released a song called Listen to the Sky in 1967. The song starts out like your typical 1967 British psychedelic rock or freak beat, if you like. A little bit of a jaunty feeling song, some distorted guitar, and it tells the story of a young man who receives notice that he has to go fight in the war. And of course, he responds to the call of duty. He becomes a pilot, and as he flies off into the mists to fight, his plane is shot down, crashes, and he dies. The song tells about how innocent, ordinary lives of young men who had their entire futures ahead of them, these men were just plucked from every opportunity they could have had to live out a normal life, and basically their lives wasted to the war machine. I think that's the message in the song. However, partway through the song, we hear air raid sirens, and suddenly the distorted guitars start mimicking the sounds of dive bombing airplanes. And then the music starts to get a little more darker. And from there on in, the Mars Bringer of War theme is introduced. Now, in the original composition, the music ends quite strikingly. If you imagine the scene in Star Wars where the Death Star is about to explode and there's that bam, 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 you know, that is how the original piece ended. And it's worthy to mention that John Williams was actually inspired by this piece to compose the Imperial March. He made one note change to put his own personal stamp on it, but basically he borrowed that Mars chord. And there have been a few other composers, at least, who have written soundtracks for movies where they took the Mars chord and just made a small adjustment here or there to make it original. But this has been very influential, not only on rock bands, but also on classical composers of the modern times. So actually, Sands also conclude their song with the same dramatic and cacophonous closure. So let's just give a listen to that. In the video that I watched where I heard about that song, one of the band members was quoted as saying that they loved to play that ending because it shocked members of the audience. They would be terrified by that really dark and crashing ending to the music. I'm going to put a link to that video below in the description. It's a video that talks about heavy songs in Britain from 1967 to 1969. That is Sands with Listen to the Sky from 1967, but 2 years later, it shows up again in a song by Andromeda. Now, Andromeda was a band put together by John Ducan, also John Can sometimes, who had just recently left The Attack. The Attack were winding down. They recorded some of their final recordings in late 68 or early 69, and then finally split up. So John Ducan put together Andromeda. Andromeda released one album in 1969, which included a song called Return to Sanity, which was actually broken into parts. And the opening part features that Mars Bringer of War theme. As we can hear, bands are cluing in on how that Mars Bringer of War theme can give that feeling of menace, of ominousness, of something dark and something tense is happening. From there on, we move on to 1970, and a very important band shows up, takes the Mars theme and puts a slight twist to it. Story goes that Terry Butler of Black Sabbath was playing that theme on his bass guitar, the boom, boom, boom. And Tony Iommi heard it and decided to put a little change. Let's take a look at the keyboard once again, how those first three notes are played. can see that it starts on the root of the G, goes up to the fifth, and then falls back a semitone to the fourth. Tony Iommi decided to do things a little differently. He went from the root note of G, went up a full octave to G, and then back to that semitone there at the fourth to make it sound like this. And that is how the famous riff for Black Sabbath's eponymous song came about. Black Sabbath used it again, however, on their next album, Paranoid, for the song Children of the Grave, only they used it more closer to the original Mars theme construction here. So let's just take a look at that on the keyboard. So I think you can see that, at least how in this case here, the use of a semitone does give that feeling of a darker atmosphere, a more ominous atmosphere. And I'm sure Black Sabbath used it in many of their other songs. Another artist to use it in 1970 was Randy Holden for his solo album Populations 2. Randy Holden had played with Blue Cheer the previous year in 1969, and he had composed a song called Fruit and Icebergs. Now, Fruit and Icebergs is the heaviest track on the album, and has always remained my favorite track from that album. He took that track, though, for his solo album, but he changed the beginning. And again, we can hear those three notes there from the Mars Bringer of War theme. So let's just give a quick listen to how that sounds. Once I heard that after preparing for this video here, I realized, oh my gosh, there's the Mars Bringer of War theme. So that gives this feeling, again, of a more heavy song. The opening to the song feels heavier than what he did with Blue Cheer. Two more examples to talk about. We move ahead now to 1977 and the band Triumph on their second album, Rock and Roll Machine. There is a song on here called The City, which is broken into three parts, and the first part is War March. What theme do you think it is they're playing for War March? Let's give it a listen. So once again, immediately identifiable, that main theme there, that main musical theme from Holst, Mars Bringer of War. We're going to hear it one more time now, showing up in 1979 on the song Am I Evil by the new wave of British heavy metal band Diamond Head. Let's just hear how that sounds on the Diamond Head song. And there it is once again. And of course, Diamond Head's song later on became repopularized when it was covered by Metallica for their Garage Days Revisited EP. So once again, Mars Bringer of War, that theme gets revitalized there in the 1980s. Have other bands done it? Well, I know that King Crimson did exactly the Mars Bringer of War composition for their album Lizard in 1970. However, that piece there seems to be centered more on mellotron from what I heard, and I don't really hear the same emphasis on electric guitar. And Emerson, Lake and Palmer also included it on their album here. What is it called? I think it's just called, sorry, Emerson, Lake and Powell. There it is. But this is, of course, exactly, both King Crimson and Emerson, Lake and Powell are doing the exact composition, not just including that one part in their music. So that's what I've got. Do you know any other examples of that Mars Bringer of War theme being used in rock music, in heavy rock music and heavy metal? Or are you aware of other songs that make use of that Mars Bringer of War chord in a riff for a song? If you do, let me know in the comments. I just thought that was a fun little thing to take a look at, how one piece of very powerful classical music actually influenced a lot of bands, as it turns out, and how the use of that root note and the fifth and the fourth with the semitone in there actually helps to give that feeling of very powerful, dark, and tense music. All right, thank you very much for watching. As I said, leave comments. Catch you in another video sometime, everyone. Take care and bye.